Heat gathered in the stones long after the sun had fallen. The city was a furnace banked low, every alley breathing stale warmth, every cistern giving off a damp, metallic scent as if the red keep had seeped into the ground and rusted the water. Even the moon looked tarnished above the tiled roofs. Arya moved with it shifting in her hair. A hard coin, a watchful eye, sometimes one, sometimes the other. She went by the shadows when the guards were near and by the lamplight when the shadows had eyes. It had been years since she knew the twist of King's Landing streets, yet her feet remembered the lean of the cobbles, the way sound carried in the underwaist, the prickle before a corner where a knife might be waiting. Memory steadied her more than breath. Sandor was a grumble and bulk beside her until he wasn't, vanishing and appearing like a boulder that had learned stealth, knocking once at a shutter with a knuckle to scatter rats, hooking her coat when she leaned too far over a low wall, swearing softly at a coil of rope someone had left to trip them. "You smell that?" he murmured in a slit of street where the wind made a brief draft out of the black. "Pitch. Tar. The kind they smear the ships with. And bodies," Arya said. There was always that in a city this size. But there was a sweetness to it tonight. Cooked meat and rinds gone high. A reminder of a market square fire and smoke in a black column. A reminder of a head falling from a wall and a girl watching through the bars. Only smoke and iron in her throat. She swallowed. She likes her city tidy and afraid. Fear keeps it still. Sandor snorted. Fear makes fools throw their torches into closets and burn their own houses. But she'll be tidy about it, Qyburn will count coffins from behind a curtain. They climbed a steep flight of steps where the stones had settled crooked and the mortar oozed out like old fat. From the top, they could look down over the sleeping roofs to the harbor. It wasn't sleeping. Mastheads bobbed like a forest in wind, black cutouts against the water. Farther out, a pinprick of light moved slow as a thought. Euron's watchfire, perhaps. Arya had never seen his face, only heard a voice calling from an execution and laughter when a dragon fell. Laughter carried. It always did. Sandor squinted. Ships nestled tighter than a brood of pigs. They're waiting for the morning. She'll come with the sun, the dragon girl. Your lot. She is not my lot. Came out quicker than she wished. I want this done before she sees the city. Arya put her hand on the hilt of needle as if checking a promise for the 100th time. And if you get yourself killed in a staircase while you're at it, then I get myself killed in a staircase while I'm at it. He growled something, low enough to be almost a comfort. You could turn around now. He said once they'd picked their way through the bones of a burnt wagon and a line of sleeping men wrapped like logs. And none would think you less. She's got a mountain guarding her bed and a spider with bell strings. You're not made of wool and luck. I have work, Arya said. I have a list. You think killing her will empty it? I don't think, she lied. She thought all the time. Names had been drops of water once, cool and clean and precise, measured with care and swallowed down. The water had dried. The cup was a habit her hand kept up. She had wanted once to feel light when it was finished. She had carried the weight of nothing and called it peace. Now she wanted, she did not know, to keep a promise made to her father under a hot sky and a shaking sword. That might be all there was. They took the sewer outfall just north of the mud gate, where the city breath and sea breath made a border, where the hungry went to fish without a net. It was low tide. The stone teeth of the drain were sharp and the slick was green on them. Sandor found an old plank with a nail sticking out and jammed it in a crack. He put his shoulder to it and the stone shifted with a groan like a man waking with a broken neck. The smell churned out at them as if it had been waiting. You'll gag us both and then where will we be? Sandor said. But the humor was a skin stretched tight over worry. He went first because he always had, and Arya dropped after him because she always had, and the water came up to her thighs and she moved through it without thinking. It was cold. It was honest. It hid. They knew the way. She had learned maps in a place where maps were made of whispers and paid for in coin and faces. Maegor's old tunnels went where stone did not want to go, beneath the walls and then up again in angles that made no sense, stinking, slick, sometimes with steps carved out of bedrock, sometimes with planks that felt a heartbeat from falling away. Rats watched them with little steady eyes, not curious, not afraid, keeping tally of the living. Arya slid a knife into one for practice, ate the meat in 4 bites without tasting it, and kept moving. Along one stretch, the stones were warmer and the air was dry. The old wildfire stores emptied and sealed, but the deep heat nested there anyway, as if memory had temperature. She pressed her palm to the wall and felt the faintest hum. If there were more caches, and there were always more caches, then Qyburn would know. Sandor held a candle cupped in his hand for a few breaths when a fork came. While it burned, his face seemed nudged by the light into an old shape that she had known better when she was smaller. The big man who had lifted her onto a horse, the big man who had taken a blow for her, the big man who had tried to sell her. The wick guttered. "We go left," he said. "The right goes up into kitchens. The left goes to somewhere we shouldn't be." "Then left," Arya said. It seemed as good a prayer as any. Near dawn, the flow of foul air changed. It slanted upward like the slope of a roof, edged with cooler salt air. They climbed a ladder that had not been climbed in years. Iron slick under their hands, iron that came off black. Sandor shouldered the hatch above them, and a gout of old dust came down, filling their mouths. He swore again, softer, as if to keep from waking a child. Arya pushed past him, hooked her fingers under the edge, and slid it with her shoulder until she could present a hand's breadth to the morning. Dull light scratched through. The room beyond smelled like spices and beeswax. When she opened the hatch enough to wriggle through, her face came up into a square of warmth. Her eyes watered. The ceiling was a low barrel vault of dark, polished wood. Jars were stacked along one wall with neat wax seals, red and yellow and black, and beside them an array of knives whose handles shone with oil. A storeroom. They had come up among delicacies and sharpened steel. Perhaps a kitchen was not far, and Sandor's memory had misled him by a turning. He climbed after her and stood very still while his eyes adjusted. The knives drew his attention like stars on a farmer's son's first night away from home. He took one, tried its balance, put it back. "You're not here for cooks," he said. "I'll keep the door." They emerged into a corridor that had been polished by centuries of people trying not to make a sound. Lintels carved with vines. Narrow windows that showed a slice of the sky the way a slit shows an eye. Servants went by in ones and twos, chin down, carrying pitchers, baskets of bread, folded cloths. None of them looked at Arya directly. None of them looked at Sandor at all. If fear keeps a city still, then habit makes it blind. Their feet knew how to look anywhere but toward something that might need a thought. Arya made herself one of them. A girl with a bundle of folded cloth and a pace that said she belonged. The old training fit like boots pulled on after a long season, a bit tight at the heel but comfortable at the toes. There were now 2 problems, and they were the same: the Queen and the mountain. Cersei would not be where she had always been at this hour. Fear had habits too, and Qyburn had filled them with new ribs. The mountain would be where Qyburn told him every moment. Arya could avoid a thing that moved. It was harder to avoid the command that made it move. She found the way by listening. Once, as she darted through a side passage to avoid the line of guards leaving the vestibule, she heard the tiniest chime. Metal touching metal, a precise, almost tender sound. Someone in a nearby room counted time with something more accurate than the bells. She slowed, placed herself so that laughter from the hall covered the opening of a door, and peered into the half-light inside. A workroom and a priesthood. Jars here as well, but the wax was greener and the smell of it sharper. A large wooden table where a map of the city lay with little ivory squares pinned to places where scorpions stood. A candle lantern hooded in brass. And Qyburn himself, hands folded, the lamplight giving his cheeks hollows he did not have, as if it tried to complete the skull he wore. He was speaking to a boy no older than she had been when she ran from this place the first time. "When I say to ring the bells," Qyburn said in a voice like dust settling, "you must go to the Tower of the Hand and tell Melessa, not the Great September. No one is fool enough to touch that. Melessa in the Hand's Tower. She has orders from me. Do not be seen." The boy nodded in a way that meant he had already failed not to be seen twice today and had lived through it. Arya memorized his shoulders and the slow way he blinked. When Qyburn dismissed him, she slipped away and let him pass her by, let his mutter about the weight of messages follow him out. If he meant to ring the bells, he meant to use them. Cersei was in her tower. Arya gathered her steady breath like thread and took it with her up 3 flights of stairs, through a solar that smelled like roses left too long in water, past a chair positioned just wrong to the window so that a woman who took her place there could see the city and be seen by it, and then past another door where the guard was an old man with a jaw that had forgotten its teeth. She knocked, and when he blinked, she said, "Lady Tina sent more pins." He let her in. The queen's rooms were long and pale and clean in the way that is paid for with other people's fear. The windows were made of small diamond panes that broke the morning into a pattern. The sun, rising, laid its net on the floor. Cersei had always liked nets she did not call by their right names. She stood at the window in a gown the color of dry leaves, her hair braided into a crown on her skull, thin in all the places where wine used to fill her. She held a cup anyway, and it trembled only a little. Arya had never seen her this close without an army between them. She had expected a smell. Perfume, perhaps, or the sharp bite of some queenly herb. Cersei smelled like a woman who slept badly and pretended not to. She turned to Arya when she heard the door, and the look on her face hardly changed. A servant was a shape in a room. The shape moved. The shape left. It had never been more than that unless it did something wrong. "Leave the pins on the table," she said without looking a second time. Arya set the bundle down on the table. There were pins inside it, stolen 2 corridors ago from a basket, and took a breath. "Your Grace," she said, and it did not harm the mouth that she spoke it with. "Your Grace, he asked if you would like to see the city today when the light comes." "He who?" Cersei kept her back to Arya, sipping. The cup tapped against her ring. "The hand," Arya said, "because it would be true for any queen and any hand." "Of course he did," Cersei said. "He will be the last to understand that I do not require anyone to tell me what I can see with my own eyes." Her eyes, Arya thought, and saw them green. A cat in a garden. A summer sea that had never known ice. Melisandre had told her blue, brown, and green. Those had been a prophecy and not a list. The cup trembled again, a tear of wine breaking away to shimmer along the rim, and Arya said in a voice that was not her own but belonged to 3 different women she had been, "If you please, Your Grace," the hand asked to be announced. Cersei turned then because she knew when to be calculated and when to be kind to appearances. She saw Arya's face properly for the first time, stripped of the smile and the lowered chin and the nothingness that let you carry trays and messages unseen. She frowned not because she recognized the girl in it, but because she could not place her instantly, and not being able to place someone instantly offended her sense of the order of the world. "What is your name?" she asked. "Arya Stark," Arya said, and the flatness of it was a kindness sharper than any knife. There was a truth with teeth in it, and she let the queen see them. Cersei laughed. She actually laughed. It began with a snort that was almost dainty and untidy at the end, then flattened into something harsh when she realized no one else in the room was laughing too. "Very good," she said. "Very good. Qyburn has a new hobby, it seems. Does a cold child bring a warm smile if you teach it the right words? Stark girls are always good at lines learned by rote." "You took my father's head," Arya said. "I did nothing," Cersei said. "A king did a thing kings do, and then the world learned to live with it as it always does. It is always learning." Arya did not note the places where the room could be used. She had already seen them. The 3 steps from the window with the narrow table that would make a poor shield, the rug dyed with onion skins that might catch a foot, the cabinet with flowered panels that had a lock heavy enough to be a weapon if torn off in time. The mountain would be close. Qyburn would appear with a whisper like a latch. The bells would ring. She had learned in the House of Black and White to make distinctions that mattered at speed. She had learned before that, in the mud and blood of a different education, that speed was sometimes a vanity and sometimes everything. She took the steps that were left to take. "I thought," she said, taking 1 step nearer, "that when I came here I would feel like the world was smaller because I had made it right again." Her voice was simple. The simplicity was armor. The other armor was smaller, needle-narrow. It lay against her palm. "I don't." "You won't," Cersei said. For a moment she seemed tired of the chair, the window, the coil of gold at her skull. "We never do. You'll look for another throat and another because you have learned that cutting them makes you real. They will flatter you for it the way they flatter me for different things." "You aren't real to me," Arya said, and stepped in. The last distance between them was the small one a voice travels twice over when it carries a lie and returns empty. She put the knife in cleanly under the lowest rib. It was a needle and not a sword. It did not go through the thick space where bones meet. It went around. Cersei's eyes widened, not because of the blood. There was no blood yet, nor the pain which would come and was her own at last. Cersei's eyes widened because a child had walked into her mourning and taken something she had not put on the shelf to be taken. Arya twisted and withdrew and twisted again. She knew what to do to make it finish quickly. It was a gift she could give and not despise herself for giving. Cersei sat down on the floor as if she had chosen to. She had never learned to fall without performing falling. She reached for Arya's wrist and found it. Her fingers were hot. She did not speak. Her breath went once, twice, a flutter like the wing beat of a caged bird, then steadied into small, astonished sounds. She looked up at the window once more, then past it, as if the sky had made a promise and she wanted to know if it was keeping it. Arya knelt and put a hand behind Cersei's head despite the bile rising in her throat. It made no difference to the world. It made a difference to Arya. When it was done, she laid the queen on the rug with her hair arranged so it would not pull when it dried. She picked up her bundle of pins, replaced the one that had fallen, and drew the cloth tight. There was no scream. The mountain did not rush in because he had not been told to. Qyburn would be counting something else for a few breaths more, pleased by his own precision. Arya walked out on feet that did not tremble. The old guard at the door blinked and she said, "She is praying." And he nodded and closed his eyes in a way that made his lashes look like a hedge in frost. They met the mountain at the turn toward the stairs. He filled the corridor like a knight fills a field, leaving no place for small things to hide in the edges. Sandor made a noise deep in his throat that was not a word or a curse or anything left to him by his mother. Gregor's eyes did not see Arya as a person, nor Sandor as a brother. They saw two objects not yet correctly placed. Her hand went for her knife and Sandor closed his hand around her wrist, not gently. "No," he said, "this one's mine." The mountain moved, a slow iron door, and Sandor moved too. Arya had seen men fight. She had seen them fight well. She had seen them fight badly and die like sticks tossed on a fire. Sandor did not do either. There was grace in him that did not flatter itself, an economy of movement the size of a big man's grief. The mountain swung. Sandor slid a half-foot and let the blow catch him a little, enough to keep him honest. He went in under the return with a knife that looked small enough to be ridiculous in any other hand and also with the knowledge of where to put that smallness. He took the big man's side with it, carving, then rebounded when the armor turned some of it aside. Gregor did not make a sound. When he moved, you could hear the plates wherever his body was no longer exactly the shape they had been made for. When he turned, there was a hiss of cloth against steel. Qyburn came to the end of the hall and stopped there like a clock that had been wound too tight. He looked past Sandor and saw a smear on the edge of Arya's sleeve. The small smile that had been making itself on his mouth, unsmiling and pleased, stopped halfway and fell back into itself. "Your Grace," he said. He said it softly the first time to the room behind Arya. He said it louder the second. He took one step toward the door, then thought better of taking the second when he saw the look on Arya's face. "Not now," Arya said without meaning to speak, and the sound of it was old and enormous and full of a god she did not know if she believed in. Gregor's gauntlet hand came for her the way a crow comes for a bright thing. Sandor put his shoulder into the blow. The corridor crushed briefly around the three of them. Arya fell back against the wall and felt a rush of air against her scalp as something heavy swung where her head had been. She rolled, as she had rolled 1,000 times onto dirt, onto stone, onto mattresses that were not hers. She came up with her knife in her teeth and another in her hand, the little curved Bravosi blade she had taken off a sailor 3 cities ago. It was good for cutting ropes and throats. She used it to slice the strap that held Gregor's left pauldron. It fell with a clank and bared less flesh than Hope had promised. She darted back before the backhand took her with it into the wall. "Get out," Sandor said, voice hardly more than a breath behind his helm. "Get out, girl. This is my road. I end it here. I won't. You will." He was still watching his brother, more closely than he had looked at anything in years. "You got what you came for. Now take what you didn't." Your breath. It was one of the few times a command landed in her like a kindness. She slid past Qyburn as Gregor's sword shrieked against the wall and took a chip from a carved vine. Qyburn tried to catch her sleeve. She looked at his hand on it and he dropped it. "You understand?" he said to the air between them, very rapidly, as if speed were reason. "You understand that if the bells ring too soon, the city will panic and panic kills. The queen is dead," Arya said, and it stunned her to hear her own mouth tell the truth so simply. She saw the thought go through him, a tremor, his mind rearranging itself around an absence. He took a step toward the door and the mountain took a step after Arya, and Sandor slammed into him and the two brothers filled the space with a sound like iron falling down a well forever. She ran. She ran down a side stair that bowed in the middle, and through a gallery where the portraits of kings watched her with eyes too shallow to see, and into a larder where 3 women stood with bread knives in their hands and their sleeves rolled to the elbow and their faces white. "Bells?" Arya said before they could scream. "Ring them now." And the oldest obeyed without understanding why, not because Arya had authority, but because sometimes the imperative in a child's voice sounded like the imperative of a flood. The woman shoved the younger 2 toward the corridor and then followed them. The first bell struck before Arya reached the outer wall. It was a deep sound the stone had been made to carry, older than any queen and more obedient to the wind than to any man. It went out over the city and the city held its breath. The second stroke lifted the breath. The third set the whole kettle to trembling. The bells were rung by human hands on ropes, and those hands were always too eager, and so the rhythm was wrong and the sound was desperate, but it was the sound of surrender. It was also the sound of fear. On the other side of the city, the far side of the river of houses and courtyards and rookeries and roofs, Daenerys stood with the wind in her hair and did not close her eyes against it. The morning had been born pale. It had become gold while she still stood still. She had not slept. There had been a night before this one when she had slept and woken to a room without Missandei and to a sky without one of her children in it, and to men who spoke to her as if their mouths were budgets and she was an account that could be balanced if they moved figures around it. The night had been long enough to drink 3 cups of wine without tasting them. Varys had been executed on the rocks with the sea watching, attentive, impartial. She had not changed since then, and she had changed entirely. Tyrion stood to her left and watched her as if she were a fire that sometimes was warmth and sometimes was destruction, and he was a man who had sat too close and could no longer tell the difference. Jon stood to her right with his honor in his hands. Sometimes it kept him upright. Sometimes, she suspected, it bent his shoulders to the side the way a man is bent when he carries a sleeping child and forgets to put it down. The bells began either too early or precisely when they needed to. Tyrion's head snapped toward the city. "The bells," he said, almost in disbelief at his own senses. "They've surrendered." Grey Worm did not move. On his face was the calm that comes when one has carried grief so long it loses edges. He had made a promise in a language older than hers. He had said many times that language matters less than intention. He was not wrong. Daenerys watched the city. The bells were a sound made by ropes and fear. Cersei had loved both. The bells were also a sound that rose from below and did not require permission. It was a wild thought. There was a kind of freedom in it she understood only as one understands pain, by recognizing its shape more than its meaning. The wind shifted and brought the harbor to her mouth. Tar, salt, iron, a whiff of something that lived in the bilge and could not die. Far out, black dots moved in a way birds do not. Ships tacking, the scorpion bolts on their decks like teeth in a jaw waiting only for the signal to clench. Above the city, the Red Keep was a hand on a throat. She put her hand on Drogon's neck. He turned his head, listening for her in places other than his ears. She had loved her children without shame. People had called them weapons to her face and had continued to insist on calling them that after she had said otherwise, because it pleased them to be right about the world. They had never learned a dragon is not a weapon. A dragon is a being whose will has weight, and whose love has consequences, and whose grief is shaped like fire because that is the shape his blood takes. She put her forehead against the scales and he breathed on her, a smell like hot stone after rain. Tyrion took a step forward. "They are ringing the bells," he said again, as if repetition would make the moment solid under his feet. "If the gates open," she went up, and the world swung under her like a bowl. The sound of the bells became less a voice and more a pulse, a beating through stone. She climbed the sky like a ladder. The light struck her armor and flashed out toward the sea so that the fleet winked as if something had thrown a signal light upon them. She skated along the line of the walls, dropped, rose, dropped, so that the scorpions on the towers could not take a line on her, and then unreeled a line of fire that took 3 of them in a breath. She did not do this because she did not trust the bells. She did this because Euron Greyjoy trusted only himself, and a man who trusted only himself made arrangements in case the world did not go his way. She burned his arrangements. On the carriage road that led to the Gate of the Gods, Harry Strickland sat his horse and tried to count the ways this had not been the battle he had been paid for. The mercenaries behind him were bored in the way mercenaries are while waiting for a fight. The bells rippled under them. Strickland had learned bells in a dozen cities. Bells meant everything and nothing. He tried to sit very straight. He thought about turning his horse and taking the company away from the city into the green where their money would spend as well as it did in walls. He might have done it if the street to his left had not vomited out a great wedge of people. Women with pots in their arms, men with children on their shoulders, an old man with a chicken under each, all of them looking at Strickland's white horse as if it might suddenly lay down and he would have to climb over it. He broke left without meaning to, and in that moment the gate behind him shuddered and barked and opened badly, so that one of its leaves stuck halfway with a splintering that went through Strickland like a laugh. He was still trying to look like a commander when Grey Worm's spearline poured through the crack like a river finding a new channel. There was a meeting then, not of minds, but of men, and it was brief because the Golden Company had been paid with gold and not with a reason. They scattered when Dothraki riders in a tight knot came shrieking down the space made by the open gate. Strickland turned his horse because there was nowhere else to turn it, and then fell off it because he had learned too late that a scorpion bolt had buried itself in the animal's flank. Grey Worm felt something small like satisfaction when the white of the company broke. He did not call it that. His mouth went dry in heat, and he lifted his hand and sent his men where they had trained themselves to go. There were 3 moments in a battle, before the first body, after the first body, and after the last. He intended to live through all 3 this time, whether or not he had decided what to do afterwards. Jon came through with the Northmen, his sword bare, his eyes moving quickly not for targets but for things that would become mistakes if left too long. He saw a boy with a knife that was too long for him and put a hand on his shoulder and did not push him forward. The boy looked wounded by kindness. Jon took another step and felt the heartbeat of the bells in the soles of his feet and in his teeth. He heard a woman screaming a name from a balcony and a man laughing in the next street because sometimes that is what a man does when he cannot help it. He lifted his sword and brought it down in a motion that was not careful and not clumsy either, and his arms remembered Winterfell and the way the breath looks in cold air and the way it had looked on a night when he had walked out of a gate a different man than the one who had walked in. Above them all, the dragon moved like a thought the city was having about itself. It set ships alight in the harbor like candles in a shrine, and then blew them out so quickly that only smoke was left. Euron stood on the prow of his flagship and raised his arms to it, as if to embrace a woman who had just entered a room and not yet decided whom to favor. He shouted something that could have been a prayer or an insult. He fired a scorpion and smiled when he saw the line of it draw true and then drop, useless, into the sea because a wing had touched the air differently. Smoke began to lay down on the city like a coverlet, but not the ash that had drifted over the streets when the September had been blown. not the thick choking of a fire that finds inside it more fire. This was thinner, a gray veil the sun shone through. The bells kept ringing until men's arms tired and were replaced by other arms. Some gates opened, some did not. The ones that did were the fault of men who decided they were too small to have principles and too old to be heroes and wanted to live through the day. The ones that did not were the fault of men who believed this was a test and that there would be a reward for the right answer. Tyrion stood on the crest of the hill where they had gathered at dawn and tried to keep the shape of the battle in his head, the way a man tries to keep the notion of a poem by repeating its first line under his breath. He had thought many times of bells and what they could be made to mean. He had begged for them because he wanted a lever longer than his arm. It had not occurred to him that someone else would pull it in a different place and at a different time. He had not accounted for a girl with a knife and a habit of finishing what the world had started without asking permission. He did not know that yet. He only knew the bells were ringing and the dragon was cutting lines out of the sky with fire, but not laying those lines down upon the clustered roofs like a blanket. He did not let his shoulders drop. He did not look at Daenerys because he did not want any man later to say he had shaped her choice with his eyes. Down in the Red Keep, a man once named Qyburn stood very still in a corridor where neck-high slices of daylight were falling in like thin loaves of bread through the windows. He looked at the door to the Queen's chamber and did not open it, and at the smear on the floor where from the corner of his eye it looked as if someone had spilled wine and from the front of his eyes it did not. He felt the old heat from the wildfire vaults under his feet. He considered the caches that still existed and the ones that were rumor and the ones that were prayer. He considered whether they would burn usefully if they burned at all. He put his hand on the door a moment and then took it away from it as if the wood bit him. Behind him there was a sound like a wall falling in a slow way. He turned. Sandor's breath made the air move in and out like a door on a hinge that needed oil. He had lost his helm somewhere and blood had made a path across his face that someone might have drawn on purpose, thin and precise from hairline to jaw. Gregor looked unhurt because what hurt could not be seen through what he had become. In a time before this time, Qyburn would have said that medicine is indifferent. It takes a body and rearranges the failures of its systems until the remainder can walk and obey. He had made something once that walked and obeyed. He had not made a man. He sometimes regretted that the world could no longer shock him. Sandor shocked him then by looking at him, and in that look was not hatred but a vague pity for any man who had put himself between two things that had to finish. "Call your dog off," Sandor said to Qyburn, voice gone gravelly where it had been stone. He did not look away from his brother. "Tell him to march into the sea until his armor drowns him." "Sir Gregor," Qyburn began, and then stopped because he had built something and mistaken it for a tool, and the mistake had lasted until it was too late to call it anything else. He took a step forward because men like him sometimes believed a step forward is courage and would protect them. Gregor swung his backhand without looking and the scholar's head struck the wall with a sound like a dropped jug. He slid down it and left a mark that would be scrubbed away later by someone who would never know whose it had been. He did not get up. Sandor laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. He said, and lifted his sword with both hands now. "Only you and me, brother." They went at each other in a clatter that made dust fall from the beams as if the building breathed. Arya could not help herself. She turned at the end of the corridor and looked back once. Sandor saw her and did not nod, but there was a flicker at the corner of his mouth that was the closest thing to a blessing he had ever given anyone without irony. Then she did what he had told her and she ran out into the light. The city had changed since she had gone in. That was what cities do when left for any length of time. Rearrange their street furniture and their politics and their smoke. The bells made a different language of sound now. A calling the dragon answered in a grammar of flame that was not the grammar of madness. She moved through a street where the cobbles had been relayed, past a shop where someone had placed a jug of water out with 6 cups beside it, and gone inside because it made more sense to be busy than to stand and watch the incomprehensible. A little girl with hair the color of molasses stared at Arya's blood-flecked sleeve, and then reached out to touch it, as if wanting to know whether the dark specks were the color red or a trick of the light. Arya put the cup of water into the little girl's hands, and the mother breathed out a long breath she had been holding since before the bells. She came to the gate of the gods with the press of people. Grey Worm's men held them away with the habitual mercy of soldiers who had been slaves and had memorized the difference between an order and a choice. An old man with blankets piled on a cart was arguing with one of them in Valyrian phrases learned from a ship captain in a bar and turned now to the wrong tense. Arya moved past them and found Jon by accident, the way you sometimes find the person you have been thinking about most intensely once you stop looking for them. He saw her and for a moment did not know her. War makes cousins of us all. Then recognition came like sunlight through cloud and a rough relief. Arya, he said. His mouth was dry, and it made her think of him in winter chewing snow to wet his lips before an exercise. It's done, she said. And only when she said it did she feel the tiredness slamming against her bones, as if it had been traveling after her and finally caught up. She is dead. He did not ask how. He did not ask if Arya was hurt. He looked at the city and then looked up and up until the dragon's shadow slid like a hand across his face. He moved with it, adjusting to the light. If the bells, they are ringing, Arya said, as if he had not heard them, though the sound was everywhere, and in the saying she made herself believe it would be enough. Jon's gaze moved again. He lifted his hand the way he had in the north when he wanted men to listen without making a proclamation of it. Hold, he said. Hold. The Northmen held because he had bled for them and died for them and risen for them and turned down power the honest way once too often for them to think he liked the taste of it. A Lannister man tried to push past into the press of people, furious and afraid at the same time, and Jon took him by the neck and moved him gently back toward a wall and did not draw his sword. A man's eyes can be persuaded. Sometimes it is even quick. Above, Daenerys flattened herself along Drogon's back and let the wind throw her hair back. She had burned the ships. It was not revenge. It was flensing. It was a way to skin a problem. She skimmed the top of the city and watched men throw away spear shafts so that the points made a rattling rain on the pavements. She saw a boy lifting an old woman's bucket into his arms and running without spilling the water. She saw a knot of men with very clean boots kick in a door with relish because they believed a sacked city was an idea and ideas were stronger than orders. She saw Jon at the gate of the gods lift his hand. The Red Keep looked smaller. It amazed her every time. How things grew tiny when seen from where birds consider the world. It made a mockery of the notion of importance. She had thought many times of the throne. She had loved and hated the image of it because it was symbolic and the world was made more by symbols than by hunger, and also because it was furniture, and people suffered for furniture, which she found obscene. The keep was a spike of stone and a collection of rooms. She dipped lower. Her dragon roared. The bells did not stop. She hovered there longer than was wise, above the place where the queen had slept, and felt something shift in the air. It was not anything so romantic as a soul leaving a tower. It was a change in the city's balance, like a tray of fruit being set down on a table so that the bowls stopped rattling. She did not know what had happened. She only knew the moment did not want the lie of a burning. She opened her hands. The air cooled a little through her gloves. She turned her head and Drogon's head turned with it. They went to the harbor and finished with the ships. On the steps of the keep, Euron tried to choose between running and swaggering. Swaggering had always worked for him. Running had worked less often because he had not tried it enough to be good at it. He took 3 steps in each direction, and then the decision was made for him when the courtyard erupted in a surge of Lannister men trying to leave a space that seemed to be shrinking behind their eyes. He got caught sideways like a crab in a rock pool and scrambled onto the edge of a fountain that had been turned off because water made men hopeful and he did not want them hopeful anymore. He shouted a name no one recognized at the top of his voice. The dragon's shadow crossed him. He crouched by instinct. Something big and smoking fell in the garden beyond the fountain and he laughed, giddy, because it missed him. When he looked again, the thing that had fallen was not a bomb but a man. His body making a shape the body should not make. People say death is smaller when it is far away. Sometimes a body is big from any height. Jaime Lannister had not meant to come to the city as a rescuer, though there is a way to tell the story where that is how it began. He had ridden hard and had thrown away all the pieces of himself that were not speed, had crossed the causeway in a rain that had hit him without wetting him, had shown his face to a checkpoint and envied how quickly it was recognized, had walked the last stretch when there was nowhere to put a horse. He had a thought he could not unthink, that he could do one last true thing, whether that true thing was to die with Cersei or to stop her from destroying something that was not hers to destroy. He fell out of a side door into a court where the agitation of people made the space seem smaller than it was. He put his back against a wall and let air scrape his lungs. The bells entered his body and sat with their backs against his ribs. His heart argued with them about timing. He looked up and saw a man on a fountain laughing nervously and felt a ridiculous fondness for men who did stupid things at exhaustion's edge. He had once been silly with a friend on a rooftop at dawn. It had been another city. All cities are the same city anyway. He took a step and then another and then ran because he had seen the thing he would not admit he had come to see. His sister's window, and in it no figure at all. He reached the corridor outside her rooms and 3 men moved toward him with their swords out and their mouths open. He lifted his hands and said his name, and one of them said a word that had a little bit of love in it, and the other 2 had a little bit of anger in theirs, and no one decided to be an idiot. He went into the room and came out again and stood still for long enough to satisfy himself that stillness had limits. When he moved again, he went not toward the ramp that led down to the cellars where he might have found a way out with a ghost, but toward the stairs that would take him to any man who could listen. He did not notice the blood on the rug, not because he had ceased to see such things, but because he had learned to see them everywhere, and a particular one did not hold his attention. He met Sandor on a landing where the light came in thin and honest. Sandor had blood on his mouth as if he'd been eating a raw steak. He held his sword down and let it drip like a dowser's rod after a job. He looked at Jaime and made a face that said, "Of all the bad coins in this bad purse, you are the least bent." "Where?" Jaime asked, which was not a helpful question. "Gone," Sandor said. It was a merciful word. "I'm not dead yet. The other one, he'll take a while to find his death, if he finds it at all. But the bells are ringing. Your queen's done." Jaime's eyes closed without his permission. They opened again quickly. He put a hand on the wall and felt it hot. "I can stop something," he said aloud because he had to hear it to believe it. "I can stop some part of it." Sandor nodded toward the yard. "Go get your men to put their swords down. They'll listen to that hand of yours if they won't listen to your mouth." Jaime smiled without joy. "That hand is more famous than it is useful." "Then make it useful for once," Sandor said, and then he turned and limped down a different stair, the one that smelled of cold stone and old water, where he could be alone with what he had done and with the version of his brother that finally had stopped moving in his head. Jaime walked out into a square where men's fear and men's training made the air thick and complicated. He took a breath, then another, and then bellowed, "Lay them down!" Came out hoarse, unlordly, and effective. Men knew his face. Men had heard stories louder and more important than the ones that were true, and sometimes the stories worked anyway. Swords came down like wheat. Somewhere, far out in the square beyond the gate, a man began to shout, "Mercy!" In the other direction, someone shouted, "Traitor!" This is how cities sound when they are deciding what to be. Tyrion found Jaime a little while later by following the line of men lowering their steel, arguing with themselves in small, stubborn voices. He had imagined this meeting for weeks, then hated himself for imagining it, then done it again because he was alone at night with thoughts that could not be put down anywhere but in his own head, and the head was not big enough for all of them. He saw his brother, and his brother saw him, and they embraced and then stepped back because it was not the time. Perhaps there had never been a time. He wanted to ask about Cersei. Jaime's face answered him before he spoke. Tyrion nodded once. The gesture contained gratitude and sorrow and 1,000 other small coins, and it spent them all in an instant. "Then it will be today," he said. "It will be this way, not another." He did not say, "And we must make it not a burning." He did not need to. Later, 2 hours or 2 years, the way the day folded, some men dragged Euron out of a corner where he had been telling himself things about fate. He was good at telling himself things. He insisted on telling other people the same things. He saw Jaime and made his face into a mockery of joy. "Kingslayer," he crowed. "Again and again, and yet you never kill the one that matters most." Jaime did not oblige him with a duel. He did not oblige him with the dignity of a response. He looked at Grey Worm and saw the cords in the soldier's throat when he swallowed. He said quietly, "Do not kill him because he wants to be killed. Chain him because he cannot bear to be chained." Grey Worm understood something in that suggestion that was not said aloud. He nodded, and Euron began to perform even his capture because that is who he had made himself to be. When the sun was the height of a man's spear length above the walls, the fighting stopped in a way that was not neat but was unmistakable. Places where blood had been splattered began to shine as they dried. A dog trotted across a square and found something that interested it and lay down beside it and panted. A Dothraki child, 9 years old, knelt and stared at a silk curtain as if it were a mountain. Someone emptied a pail of water onto the stones and sat with their head in their hands until the steam stopped rising. Daenerys came down out of the sky and landed inside the courtyard of the Red Keep. Men gaped. She dismounted with her hair tangled and her eyes sore, and something in her that had been a string wound too tight eased without breaking. Drogon settled with a huffed breath that shook flags. He turned his head and put it so close to the ground that a guard had to hop out of the way. He was eager the way creatures are when they are done killing and want to be told they are good and still part of the pack. She put her hand to his jaw and laughed once in true surprise, because laughter can be the sound of a person discovering they have not yet been turned only into a symbol. Then she went through the doors in a small storm of attention and expectation, and the rustle of breath that follows someone powerful and young the way dry leaves follow a wind. The handmaidens had not scrubbed the queen's rooms yet. They stood outside in a cluster with their hands clenched and their faces red-eyed, not with grief but with exhaustion and shock. Tyrion was there before her, and Jon entered a moment later, and Arya leaned against a doorjamb as if a little ready to be knocked down if anyone were so unwise as to try. Daenerys took in the room. She took in the rug with a dark place on it that had been carefully dealt with, and the absence that had settled itself in the furniture, and the window that faced the city, now a different city because a woman did not stand at it. She had imagined coming into this room in 100 ways. She had imagined Cersei on the floor with her hair undone and blood like jewelry. She had imagined Cersei on the throne with fire behind her and a smile sharp as a quill. She had imagined herself doing many things to that image. None of those were here. Her eyes went to Arya, who stood with her weight on one foot the way a fighter does after a hard day, her face almost empty of expression and yet full of watchful intelligence and something weary and undeceived. "It was you," Daenerys said. Arya did not preen. "I could not know what you would do," she said. "I thought fewer would burn if she was not here to use them for tinder." Daenerys felt irritation come and be turned aside by some more accurate feeling. "You were right," she said. She did not say, "Or you were right enough today in this arrangement of air and stone. I would have burned the fleet anyway." "Yes," Arya said. "That is not the city." Tyrion made a sound as if something had been lifted off his chest but left a bruise where it had rested. Jon put his hand on the back of a chair and did not sit. "What did she say?" Daenerys asked, and this was not a queen's question but a young woman's. "At the end, that she had done nothing," Arya said. "That a king had done it. That's what she said to me once before. I think she believed that saying it made it true." Daenerys nodded. She knew something about the dangerous ease of a sentence that lets the tongue off the hook. She walked to the window and looked out. She had expected to feel triumphant. She felt not small, which would be untrue and self-flattering, but keenly aligned to the city, aware of the way it breathed. The bells had slowed. The people below had begun to move again in patterns that looked like life. A ladder rose against a wall somewhere in the gilded distance, and a man climbed it very deliberately, rung by rung, as if he were doing the most important thing anyone had ever done and must do it correctly. "We will need grain," she said. "We will need water not from wells that taste of iron. We will need surgeons. We will need mothers who know how to quiet children. We will need to keep the soldiers from taking what is not theirs. We will need to punish some of them when they do. There will be many who think fear is faster than patience. They are not wrong. They are not what I will be." Tyrion's eyes flickered. "There are also decisions that must be made whose seeds were planted before today," he said gently. He meant a throne. He meant a truth Varys had sown across the land in a handful of letters he had sent and a handful more he had not. Jon stood very straight, as if straightness could keep his face from showing what he thought. Arya's gaze went from one to the other and then to the dragon's shadow moving like a curtain on the courtyard. "Not here," Daenerys said. "Not now. Today the living will tend to the living." There was a surprise in that room, a soft rearrangement of air. Men of war do not often expect to be given work that looks like carrying water. Arya heard herself say, "I know a woman near the mud gate who keeps a store of vinegar for washing linens. You will want it for wounds." She did not know why she offered it to a queen. She did not know why the queen nodded as if she had been given a treasure. Perhaps today both of them understood something that was not a weapon and could still be true. They made the city move in the afternoon like a machine that had been left outside and rusted a little but kept the habit of functioning in it. Davos appeared as if summoned from the sea by the loosening of iron upon water, and he had a dozen men with him who knew how to make men listen without tearing their ears off. Grey Worm organized the Unsullied into cords that stretched across streets and made lanes through which mothers and broken-legged men could pass. Dothraki boys whose fathers had taught them to steal horses stood by doors and kept those doors from being kicked in. Some of them learned quickly to like the feeling of giving things rather than taking them. Some did not. A very small number of those were corrected with a very public efficiency that made a different kind of fear move through the city. The kind that says, "You will be shamed among your brothers if you do this, and sometimes that is worse than pain." Jaime went with a company of Lannister veterans whose faces were old enough to have been boys with him when he was a boy. He spoke to them low and said things like, "Your city will be better if you act as if your mother were watching, whether or not she is dead." It turned out mothers were powerful even when dead. They unbarred a granary near the fishmonger's square and found it half full because corruption had slowed even the greed of those who had signed for its contents. They distributed. They pretended not to see a boy snatch and run. They pretended to see and then pretended to chase him, and it turned a loaded moment into a joke and a joke into a way to keep from crying. Tyrion found Qyburn's body at dusk, being carried down the steps by two men who had drawn a cloth over his face. He lifted the cloth and looked at what had once been a curiosity and a horror and now was neither. He put the cloth back very carefully, as if he were covering a mirror. "I had a teacher once," he said to no one in particular, because the men carrying the body did not meet his eyes. He said, "We make monsters to excuse ourselves from killing men." He said, "Sometimes we are only wrong about the names." He stepped aside and let the men go on. Euron tried jokes on his jailers that night and got no laughter. He tried threats and got no fear. He sang a song about a seagull and got a thrown shoe. For the first time in his memory, he understood that he had been demoted from the center of a story to its margin. He found it intolerable. He muttered to himself about prophecies he had made up entirely and found them less persuasive than usual. A rat paused by his foot and then went away because it had better things to do. When the last light went, Arya sat on a step in the yard where the stones were still warm and thought she might fall asleep sitting up. Sandor came out of a half-broken door and sat down a little distance from her with a grunt that was eloquent in ways words are not. For a time they listened to people who had found a way to speak to each other again without orders. The talk was not yet light. It would not be for days. But in places it loosened, so that a man's gesture contained a shape that might become a smile in a different light. "You finished something," Sandor said after a while, not as a question. "No," Arya said, and then tasted the truth of it and said it again. "No. I only made it so that someone else did not finish something worse. He scratched in his beard, then stopped because the scab there tugged and hurt and reminded him he was still a man with skin. "That's enough for most days." "I thought I would feel different," Arya said. "Sometimes I think the names wanted to be said more than the throats wanted to be cut. Sometimes I think the cut was only the echo of the saying." "You're talking like a septa," Sandor grunted. "Go find a piece of bread and a sleeping place and let your head feel like a head again. In the morning, when the piss carts start rolling and the crows complain about the taste of things, you'll think the same thoughts and they'll bother you less." She did find a piece of bread. It was hard. She ate it as if she were chewing on the day and trying to get all the taste out of it. She found a sleeping place in a wine cellar where the smell reminded her of her father and homes she could not have again. She slept like a person who had not decided whether to wake up. In the morning, the business of ruling began to replace the business of taking. It is less dramatic, and men made for war resent its smallness, and women made for survival trust it more because they have been doing it always. Daenerys did not sit the Iron Throne. She sat a wooden chair with one broken leg she propped with a folded cloth, and heard petitions in the throne room that had been scrubbed with vinegar and human hands until its old stink faded. This was a choice. She would sit the throne when it meant something other than a chair none had earned. She had learned one lesson very young and had had it pressed on her again and again: that people care more about what they are called than about what is done to them. She had said often she would break a wheel. Today she thought, perhaps to break a thing you must learn its spokes and where they enter the hub and why they hold. She put before her not a list of punishments, which might be all that was asked of her, but a list of pleasures denied and given back. Markets opened with guards who had nothing to sell, baths reopened with water boiled and poured by men who had once held knives, a corner for children who had lost their people and needed a woman to scold them and to feed them both. Tyrion moved quiet as a minister and loud as a bell. He drafted orders that did not sound like orders and put them in the mouths of men who had been enemies yesterday and were useful today. He found the quartermaster of the city guard hiding under a wagon in his own courtyard and had him put back into his office with a different seal, and told him a story about how he would be remembered if he did this well that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with pride. People like to hear that wind will carry a thing they have done into places where they will never be seen. He sent a raven to Sansa. He did not tell Jon. He did not tell Jon. It was one of those actions that make themselves because the hand that writes cannot help itself. Jon ate with his men in the yard, a bowl of something that called itself stew by habit, and inspected a gash on his forearm as if it belonged to a table he had inherited and planned to use for years. When men began to whisper to him, men whose whispers echoed those of other men, far away, and of letters that had flown while others slept, he did not answer the whispers. He did not ask to be left alone. He answered other questions at louder volume until tiredness made the whispers stop. It was a tactic. It was not policy. He would have to find a policy. He found Arya instead, and that saved him from the luxury of thinking too many thoughts at once. She stood with a woman in a blue dress who wore an apron stained with vinegar and something else. They were making a list of linen. Arya had changed somehow again into a person who could take down names and not feel it as a demotion, who could lean into a small, necessary column of figures with the same attention she gave to the cracks in a man's armor. This was a skill. He wished he had it. "You are making yourself busy," he said. "It is either that or consider what I have done and decide whether to be a monster today," Arya said without looking up. The woman in blue nodded as if she recognized the thought. "You are not," Jon said. "Not today," Arya said. "Not in the way that word is used." He wanted to offer her something that would unburden her as a sword unburdens by being lifted. There was nothing. "What will you do when this is done?" he asked instead. "Leave," she said. "There is a map that stops at the coast, always with a little line of decoration that pretends the world ends tidily there. I don't believe it. I want to walk past the edge of the paper and see what scribbles beyond it." "You'll fall off," he said, and smiled, and she smiled too briefly. "You never fall when men expect you to." "I learned from cats," she said. "I don't always land on my feet. I just make the fall doing not quite what it thought it would." That afternoon a delegation came from the Iron Bank, as if it had been writing itself across the sea the moment the bells began. The men were neat and dry and tired from a journey that had been inconvenient to their schedules. They had one woman with them who did not speak and carried their papers. They spoke carefully to Daenerys about obligations and credit and the history of forgiving certain debts and the danger of forgiving others. She listened and nodded and then explained the math of food, which is unruly, and of winter, which takes fees in advance and laughs at projections. Tyrion watched and felt a small, private pleasure. The young woman who could burn a fleet also knew how to make a room of bankers squirm without raising her voice. "Yes, her," in a glance, become a queen as much by what she did not do as by what she did. It almost made up for knowing that in other rooms men would gather and question her blood and the shape of her jaw. He did not let that thought go. He merely placed it on a shelf he could reach easily later. Sansa's raven arrived on the third day with the long shadow of the afternoon. She did not waste words. She never had. She wrote of the north as if describing a patient whose fever had broken, and of stores of food and of distances and days and of loyalty in the way a general writes of rivers. Honestly, because lying about a river is the fastest way to drown. She ended with a line that sounded like bone under velvet. The North had not bent for a southern queen since a man with a dragon had extracted a bow by lying across it with his full weight. She did not wish to repeat history. She did not say, "We will be independent." She made it an outcome toward which the facts walked by themselves. When Tyrion gave the letter to Daenerys, she read it twice. Jon did not ask to see it because he had seen Sansa write letters since she was 10, and he could hear her voice in the scratch of the quill even through 2 rooms and a messenger. Daenerys looked at him, and he looked at her, and the room held still for a moment because 2 truths had walked into it and would not leave without making a noise. "I will not ask for what is not given," she said. "I will not pretend to have kindness when I have only calculation. I will not pretend calculation when I have only kindness. If the North wishes to be what it is, then let it be. I am not a collector of crowns. There is much to be done farther south than snow." Tyrion exhaled in a way he hoped no one noticed. Jon's face did a strange thing and then stopped doing it. It might have been relief. It might have been grief. A man can be both. "Then there will need to be a council," Tyrion said. "A great one. Not because councils solve anything by themselves, but because when people see that others are watching, they sometimes behave better out of vanity if not out of goodness." "Arrange it," Daenerys said. He did. He found banners rinsed in the river and hung to dry. He found a place in the dragon pit where the smell of droppings had been replaced by the smell of dust and human endeavor. He sent ravens to men he despised and to women he had learned not to underestimate and to children with names older than their houses. They came because the dragon had spared the city, and because a rumor ran that the queen had chosen grain over executions for the first 7 days, and because a man whose name was neither king nor prince but carried letters in it that made people nervous stood at her side and did not seem to want anything except for a room to be quiet long enough for sense to be heard. They sat under the open sky, where even kings must squint, and they watched Daenerys walk to the center with something in her carriage that was not swagger and not humility but the balance between them where real power walks. She spoke first of bread, which is always how freedom must begin. Then of the city, which needed the kingdoms more than the kingdoms needed it. Then of the sea, and of the menace it brings when men like Euron get more than a boat. Then last of thrones, which were props, and of laws, which are habits of mind, and of the way men tell themselves stories to make habits easier to follow. When she finished, there was a moment in which nothing made a noise, and that, Tyrion thought, was the sound of hope before it finds a shape. He stood, with his bad leg protesting and his head buzzing in the heat, and proposed something that had been a joke once and would not be now. That the kingdoms choose and choose to choose again, and that if a king or a queen tried to make their child the law, then may that child grow up in a house full of people who laugh at them. There was laughter, a little genuine. There was squabbling, of course, and objections dressed in old words, and an old man's harumph, and a young woman's muttered curse. They argued for hours because arguing itself was the comfort and the entertainment. At the end, as dusk found them where they sat, they were not anointed and they were not unified and they were not nearly so wise as they would tell others later they had been. But they had done something new and called it good. They chose Daenerys to rule the southern kingdoms because she had taken a city without remaking it into a cemetery, and because she had dragons and had not used them on faces. They chose Sansa to rule the north because the north had insisted, and because Sansa had that face a woman has when she has counted barrels in winter and found barrels enough. They chose other women and men for other places, and titles shifted as if the world had changed its clothes. Jon declined anything large and took instead a duty like the sea. To ride and to watch and to carry words from place to place, to be the king's road made flesh, if a road could be someone who knew when to step lightly and when to step hard. Arya stood on the periphery and felt herself already far away. She had made something happen that would never be written down accurately in any book. She was used to that. The book had never once gotten her right either. She looked at the horizon and saw it as a line on a page that insisted on being turned. She said her goodbyes in the way she was capable of. To Jon, she gave a knife and a smile with some of its light dulled by reality and said, "Use this only for bread and idiots." He laughed and the sound cleared a space around them. To Sansa, when she arrived with her banners and her education, she gave a single hard embrace that made their armor creak and said, "You were right about every dress you ever told me was wrong." Sansa smiled and did not cry, which was a victory she would allow herself only later, alone. To Daenerys, Arya gave a nod and a word. "Do not become what you have beaten," and Daenerys nodded back with a severity that took a moment to crack into real understanding. "Help me not to," she said, and it was the most honest request she had made as a queen. Sandor did not come to the quay where Arya's boat would push off. He had already left, walking down a road that would become a trail that would become a rumor that would become nothing. He had told her 3 days before, "I'll go where there are hills and no stupid men," and she had told him, "Then you'll be lonely," and he had grunted and said, "I've been lonely in rooms full of people my whole life, girl," and for once she had not had a clever retort. She stood on the dock with Davos, who knew ships and knew goodbyes, and with a boy who had asked to go because the sea had been a voice in his ear since he was small. The tide climbed the pilings with old, patient hands. The cities a person carries inside them have many tides too. She watched the line of the water wanting something and then having it, and thought, how much of life is that? Tyrion came at the last and offered her a small parcel. "Cheese," he said gravely. "No journey has ever been made worse by cheese unless it is already bad, and then the cheese will not save it." She took it, grateful beyond the joke, because cheese is a kind of faith you can eat. "Keep her honest," she said, meaning Daenerys. "I intend to keep myself honest," he said. "It is harder." She stepped into the boat then, and the men pushed away, and the oars took the water in a rhythm that was not music and would become it if persisted in. She looked back once at the city that had taken her father and given her skill, that had burned once and had not burned again. The wind lifted her hair, and it carried the smell of tar and of bread and of vinegar and of human breath. She did not smile. She simply breathed. On a day weeks later, when the ship was making its own weather at the edge of chart, sailors had folded and refolded until the edges were soft. Arya woke before the light and went to the bow and saw a thing like a cloud that was not a cloud, low and white and changing shape to please itself. She leaned forward and wondered what name it would someday have. Then she let the wondering go. A name is what other people put on a thing. Discovery is the thing you do with your own hands. Back in King's Landing, Daenerys sat in the throne room on her wooden chair and listened to a woman petitioning for a well and to a boy offering to fix the bell ropes because he was clever with knots. She rendered judgments that were sometimes really wishes. She felt the shape of power under her fingers the way a mason feels a stone and knows where it will sit. She did not always do right. No one does. But she did not burn the city and called that a beginning. Grey Worm walked the walls at dawn when the air is thin and honest, and held in his mouth the name of a woman he would never again say, and turned that, too, into a beginning. Jon rode out of the gates and took the old road north, not because he fled but because the road needed taking and because it led toward a land that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Sansa returned to Winterfell and counted the grain and the lives and found, this time, that they might make enough. Jaime went to the sept that had not been blown up and lit a candle. He did not know whether he prayed. He did know that when he took a breath and let it out slowly, it did not catch on something sharp inside him as often as it had. Tyrion read letters and wrote letters and drank wine that was not very good and insisted it be poured anyway because the sweetness is not in the cup. He told stories that were not entirely true to men who needed them and then later corrected them when they were ready to hear better ones. He made the practice of governance both dull and merry as he could manage. On a summer evening months later, when the tiles of the Red Keep had stopped holding heat through the night and only breathed it out a little after sunset, Daenerys stood at the window Cersei had stood at and looked out over a city she had not destroyed. It was not a lesson, not a triumph, not a prophecy fulfilled. It was a thing made by hands and will and accident and refusal, and she loved it with a complicated, adult love that makes rules for itself and tries to keep them. Behind her, the bells hung silent. They would ring again, for births and deaths and for danger and for surrender. She thought of the girl with the tired eyes who had made them sound when it mattered most, who had unstitched a thread that would have sewn the city into a shroud, and she thought, sometimes it takes the smallest blade to cut the widest cloth. And the world moved, and the wind from the sea brought the smell of salt and spice, and in the far distance a ship went on, past the edge of the paper. The first storm to roll in after the taking of the city came up from the south as if it were a delegation, gray-caped and stiff with formality. It arrived without thunder, only with a wind that flapped banners into awkward shapes and made roofs mutter. People looked up with the old reflex. If there is rain, there will be water, and if there is water, we can boil it, wash wounds with it, put it to use, and for a day the junk of fear clattered less loudly in the alleys. Yara Greyjoy rode in under that rain with a hood thrown back so the wet could touch her. She would never admit it, but she needed the salt from the sky to taste like home. She dismounted in the outer ward and handed the reins to a man who, a year ago, would have drawn his knife at the sight of her and tried to win a story to tell by dying. He took the horse as if he had done it all his life. "Your Grace," Yara said to Daenerys when they faced each other in a hall that still smelled faintly of smoke and vinegar. "I would remind you of a bargain made between a queen at sea and a woman with fewer ships than she liked to pretend." Daenerys remembered the wind that day, and the way Missandei's smile had made the deck warmer. "I have not forgotten," she said, "nor will I. The Iron Islands shall have what was promised them, to govern themselves and to cease their raiding of the mainland. If you raid, you do it without my protection and without my regard. If you do not, we will trade. Either way, your uncle will never trouble your shores again." Yara's mouth tightened when Euron's name had not even been spoken and yet had been named. "You have him, in a cell not far from your feet," Daenerys said. "He will have a trial." Yara snorted. "A rope is a quicker trial, but if a trial is what you must do to make your city walk, then bind his mouth first. It is the worst part of him." They did not bring Euron to the hall. They took Yara down to the cells, where air had learned to stop moving. Euron looked smaller there only because his stage had been taken away. He smiled with a part of his face that was not dependent on good humor. "Niece," he said, "you still believe in doors and windows and things that line up. A pity." She looked at him as if measuring him for a box. "You had your storms," she said. "Time to drown. Say it like a prayer," he said, and looked past her, trying to find anyone who would take the bait of mockery and feed him. No one did. When she turned away, he tried a last time, soft, almost human. "I did what the world allowed me. So did the sea," Yara said. "That never made it kind." His trial was not a grand affair. There was no appetite for a spectacle. It was a demonstration that words had rules again. Davos read the charges with the unadorned cadence of a dockmaster's tally, and Tyrion examined the manner of his captures and his cruelties as if laying tools upon a bench. The ambushes, the torchings, the bowing and unbowing to Cersei's whims, the bolt loosed that sent a dragon whirling down into the water like a falling star. Euron tried to infect the room with his voice. The room refused to catch. Grey Worm stood at the back like a fact. Yara did not speak until the end. Then she said, simple as weather, that the islands recognized no law higher than the one that kept boats floating and children fed. But they would honor this judgment, and so would she, and the honor, this time, would be the end of a man. He died without clever last words because they did not allow him to waste anyone's time. There was a wind at the gallows, and it took the sound out of the rope. Yara watched without triumph and walked away before anyone could take the look on her face and use it for a song. Later, she drank with Davos, who had the good sense to drink without speaking. "Your queen spared this city," Yara said at last. "I have not seen that done by anyone who owned fire and wanted a thing." "She owns more than fire," Davos said. "Some days that will be enough. Other days you'll be glad there are other hands to hold her to it." "Yours," Yara said. "Any that will," Davos said. "We build a ship together or we all drown." That's the only sermon I know. The Great Council in the Dragon Pit had not ended the habit of councils. It had started it. People discovered they liked the astonishment of hearing themselves say sensible things with their enemies listening, even if the sensible thing was, "My people first." They discovered they liked being thanked for not being as foolish as they might have been. Men who had only spoken at feasts now found themselves speaking in rooms with rugs. Women who had only spoken in kitchens found themselves listened to because there was not enough bread to allow anyone to be stupid about who knew the ovens. Gendry came up from the Stormlands with rain still in his clothes, and Daenerys received him in a courtyard where the puddles reflected a broken sky that mended itself as you watched. He stood awkward, as if he had grown 3 inches on the road and had not had time to tell his limbs about it. Tyrion stood to one side and smiled at the fact that some boys are too honest to be graceful. "You bowed to me once," Daenerys said. "You knelt, and then you stood, and then you went and did work in a place filled with ghosts." "I ran for a while first," Gendry said, because he could not help telling the truth even when it made him look smaller. "I'm better at hammers than at kneeling. But I came." "You are Robert Baratheon's son," she said. "You fight with a hammer and you hate what you're supposed to hate a little less than you are supposed to. You have friends who are inconvenient. You are loyal because you do not know how to be otherwise. The Stormlands will need a lord who does not try to turn them into a story about himself. Will you be Lord of Storm's End?" He blinked. There was a time when those words would have been a punch to the chest. Now they were a weight, and he felt his legs adjust under it like a man learning to carry barrels 2 at a time. "I haven't got the right blood," he said. "You have blood enough to keep men from stabbing you in corridors for a year while you get your feet under you," Tyrion said. "And the rest, no one has the right blood. It's a superstition for people who can't count. What you need is a roof that doesn't leak, fields that don't flood, men who don't sell the grain twice, and the habit of not lying to yourself about what you can do. The rest can be taught." "And if I fail?" Gendry asked. "You will," Daenerys said, and he looked up, startled. "Not in every way, but in many. You will fail, and then you will correct yourself. The first is inevitable. The second is a choice. The Stormlands need a man who can learn. Rise, Lord of Storm's End." He rose clumsily and did not bow properly, and then corrected the bow and almost fell. Tyrion did not laugh. He felt a small, sharp hope lodge like a splinter in his thumb. Sometimes the world improves by accident. Brienne arrived with her hair wet and her armor polished to an honesty that made other men's metal look like lies. She came because Sansa sent her and because Jaime had written a letter with more crossings out than words. She came because there was work and because there were vows that had to be translated into new words before they could be kept again. She found Jaime removing an old banner from a hall. The Red Lion came down with a hiss. He looked at her as if surprised not by her presence but by the way it made him breathe differently. He had never learned to be graceful around forgiveness. "You wrote nonsense," Brienne said, not unkindly. "But you wrote it to the right people. Nonsense is sometimes all there is," he said, holding the weight of the cloth in both hands as if it were a child being passed down from a window. "Will you serve her?" "I will serve the realm," Brienne said. "She is the realm's chance. I will make that chance less foolish if I can." She paused. "There is a book." He closed his eyes briefly. "There is always a book." The white book had been saved by a junior scribe who had a habit of putting important things where no one would look for them. Beneath a drawer that did not seem to open at all. It was scorched slightly along one edge. Brienne stood in the armory where it now rested, clean and quiet, and turned pages that felt like a sacrament. She found Jaime's, the faded lines and the clear lines, the long blank space where a man's ending should be. She took up a pen with exaggerated care, so as not to let her hand know what she was doing until it was too late to stop. She wrote of what he had done that day, of walking into squares and making men's swords go down by asking rather than striking, of sending carts to the streets where he had played as a boy because he knew where food would gather best, of telling a band of sellswords their employment was ended with. Out blood. She did not gild. She did not lie. She wrote what the day had been and left out how his voice had broken once when he told a child to take the bread anyway. At the end, she paused with the pen hovering and then added a line that would look arrogant in any other hand. He helped to keep a city from burning. She sanded it, closed the book, and let the quiet after a thing is done settle upon her like a cloak. Jaime found her there and stood in the doorway until she looked up. "Is it bad?" he said. "It is true," she said. "Today that is better." He nodded. "I will not ask to read it." "You will not need to," Brienne said. "You know what you did." She wished, unexpectedly, for Podrick with his clumsy joy. In the yard she found him teaching a boy to sit a horse without clamping his knees too hard. She felt a swell of happiness surprise her like rain. The Iron Bank tried to be clever. It always did. Men came in orderly groups and asked to see figures. Tyrion showed them figures, and then he showed them streets. He took them to the dock where Davos had boxes lined up twice as long as their ledgers and filled with items more persuasive than any promise. Grain sacks marked with the seal of some hard-headed northern matron, salt cod stacked like shingles, barrels of clean water with their lids sealed in wax and then sealed again with a ribbon and a boy's knot. He found a way to make the bank remember that coins move faster when the roads are not on fire. "We will restructure," the tall one said with the pride of a man who believes he has invented a new word. "We will take the port fees from Lannisport for a season and the lighter customs in White Harbor for 2 if Lady Sansa agrees." "She will," Tyrion said. "She sent them as offerings before you asked for them. Write that in your book. Put it in gold leaf if it helps you sleep." "And the crown's mines," began the short one. "Do not speak to me of mines," Tyrion said. "The Rock has not paid in or for a decade and more. If you are still crediting that on your accounts, the fault is yours. We will pay in what exists. In salt, in grain, in rope, in labor. We will pay in years of quiet. It will be slow. You will hate it. You will live." They left without satisfaction, which is the only honest way for bankers to leave. Behind them, Bronn sauntered in, as if he had been standing behind the tapestry counting his future. He put a boot on a chair and then took it off, remembering where he was, not out of respect, but because new habits are easier to sell in a fresh room. "You once promised me a castle," Bronn said. "Might be you promised it while we were riding and the horse was doing most of your talking. But you promised. And you once promised me you would not shoot me with a crossbow in the middle of a negotiation," Tyrion said pleasantly. "We have both had to be flexible. What about Highgarden?" Bronn said, like a man asking for a cloak and expecting to be handed a blanket and a scolding instead. "What about you not being a fool?" Tyrion returned. "Highgarden is dead and needs a farmer, not a robber. There is a small matter of having burned the last Tarly who might have been able to make pledge to it. I will not begin a reign by setting a sellsword to rule a plain. But coin is better than land when coin is flowing. Become master of coin. Steal less than the last man. Make the bank grumble and pay, and I will see you draped in comforts you cannot drink." Bronn opened his mouth to make a joke and found his tongue hitched. He did not like the idea of being respectable. He liked the idea of having a house with a roof in winter better than he disliked respectability. "Master of coin," he chewed.
"Sounds like ist."
"It is," Tyrion said. "All offices are jokes until the work makes them otherwise." He tilted his head. "If you do it poorly, I'll have Davos take your chair and I'll set you to count fish." "Fish don't sit still," Bronn said. "Neither does money," Tyrion said. Grey Worm's decision took longer. The Unsullied set their camp within the walls not because they liked walls, but because the people within them learned to step around them without fear sooner. They did not leave their spears by the doors of inns. They did not dance. They did not seek company. They began to learn the names of streets the way soldiers learn the slope of ground. Each night Grey Worm walked a different rampart and filled his mouth with the name that would not leave it. He had told Missandei of Noth he would go there. Like many promises, it had been made in a world that no longer existed by the time it came due. He asked Davos about the butterflies. "Men say they kill foreigners," Davos said. "Men say many things about places they have not been. Men also say that storms know your name," he added, looking at the young commander as if measuring the parts of him that were more boy than bronze. "I'll tell you what I know. The sea makes fools of plans faster than war does. Grey Worm looked at the water as if it were a rank being formed. She loved that place, he said. She loved it because it was hers and because it had not been taken from her. I will not bring blades there that will make the air sick, but there will be a way to keep it as it is. I will send a ship first, with men who have healed and men who know plants. If they do not sicken, we will go. We are not hasty. We are only sure. Davos nodded. That's a sailor's plan, he said, approving. Let the tide go and come again before you go with it. When the first ship left with Unsullied aboard who were not chosen for strength but for steadiness, Daenerys stood on the wall and watched with Grey Worm in silence. She had left so many places herself that watching another man go became a way to honor her own departures. He did not look at her, and she did not speak to him of thanks. Between them lay a kind of loyalty that does not feed on words and therefore does not go hungry when they fail. Bring me word, she said at last. I will bring you truth, he said. And if the truth is that we cannot go to Noth? She asked, not because she doubted his resolve, but because a queen must say aloud what others refuse to think. Then we will go somewhere that is not Noth, he said. We will carry her with us there. His voice did not break. A small muscle in his jaw did. Jon rode the roads that were older than the houses that lined them, and slept in halls where men had painted over one coat of arms with another so many times that the paint was thick as plowed ground. He had with him a company that changed like the weather, a blacksmith who had made nails in 3 kingdoms, a woman who had decided her son would not grow up believing that mercy was a weakness and had made that decision into the way she walked, 2 boys too young and too stubborn to stay behind. He carried no banner of his own and did not need one. The letters Varys had sown had sprouted in odd places. The knowledge of his parentage grew like weeds along the road, disruptive and resilient. In some villages men touched 2 fingers to their brow when he rode past as they might to a saint whose icon they had been taught to fear and then to love. In other places they looked at him and saw a man who might eat and leave too soon. At Fairmarket a lord with neat hands and a voice like a reed in a flute asked him if he would not, perhaps, think on how natural it would be to sit in a chair carved with dragons. Jon listened and did not insult the man by pretending not to understand. Natural is snow in winter, he said. Natural is a river running downhill. What you mean is familiar. I do not think that is the same thing. I'm doing this work. I will keep doing it. Ask men whether they are happier to be heard than to be ruled. If I find enough who prefer the chair, I'll come back and quarrel with you properly. The man looked offended. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, changed his face for the better. I will begin asking, he said. I may not like the answer, nor will I, Jon said, but it will be ours. He came to the twins and found a bridge that could not be boiled and put back together in a day. He found a hall that had been fumigated with smoke and story, as if either could banish a stench left by old murders. He ate the meat that was set before him without drama and told the lord there, one of Walder Frey's sons who had learned the art of looking smaller than he was, that the next time he demanded double toll of caravans, the caravans would find a ford to make their own and his bridge would be empty as a man's boast at dawn. He did not threaten. He did not need to. People had learned that quiet came dressed in black cloaks as often as in velvet, and that there were 2 kinds of cold. The one that killed you and the one that kept you honest. Sometimes he rode alone for a stretch, letting his men move ahead to a village where bread waited. He found a copse once where the wind said a thing to the leaves that made them shiver in place like girls after a dance. He sat his horse and thought of ghosts not as sadness but as company. He did not speak to them. He did not ask them for anything. He simply sat until the horse's breathing slowed to match his, and then he went on. In Winterfell, Sansa endured the first flush of being obeyed and the long ache of having to be right. She had dreamed as a child that ruling would be a necklace. Turned out to be a ledger. She did the sums. She asked men without pity to show her how the ice would break if it had to, and how the river would flood, and who would die first if the snow went long. She asked women where their larders were hidden and how to get bitter taste out of old grain, and which girls were likely to grow with quiet competence into women who would save their neighbors without anyone giving them a title for it. She received a letter, folded twice more than it needed to be, signed with Tyrion's hand. He told her of Bronn's appointment in a tone that invited her to laugh in private, and of Gendry's new name in one that asked her to consider what that meant for the balance of knives. He told her Daenerys had not pressed the north and had spoken instead of roads. He did not draw little hearts in the margins. She read it and felt a sting she recognized. Not love. That wound had long since been salted. But the intelligent affection that grows between people who have learned to stand beside each other in rooms that wish them dead. She answered with a list of the number of carts they could spare each month for the next 6, of how many boys of 14 she would permit to go south to learn trades and how many of 16 she would not, of the number of sheep thin enough to be culled before the first true frost. At the end she wrote, "The North will not be governed by a southern hand, but we will not refuse a hand when it is at work in the same field. Do not mistake pride for strength. Do not mistake courtesy for surrender." She sent Brienne a smaller note that said only, "I am glad you are where you are. There is a girl in Barrowton who has your eyes and thinks she wants to fight with a sword. Train her to fight with her head and heart first, and the sword if you must." Back of beyond the edge of maps, Arya found water that had forgot how to be blue and remembered only how to be vast. They sailed west until the crew learned to count not days but the smells the wind brought. The breath of cold iron, the fishy rot of sargassum, the sweet, almost cloying note of far-off palms. They named birds and currents until the names fell away and the things remained. She learned the ship's moods, how the mast spoke when it did not like the set of a sail, how the deck shivered a little before a squall, as if it were an animal. She did not become captain. The ship had one already, an old woman whose hair was white only because Salt had argued with it for 40 years, who had once seen ass high from a safe distance and had learned the safest distance is often further than you think. Arya became what she had always been, the one who watches, who learns, who goes where others hesitate because she wants to know what hesitation is made of. One morning the wind turned and held its breath, and the sea sealed itself into something slippery and smooth. The old woman spat and said, "The slope." No one knew if that was a place or a mood. They went slowly. Arya stood at the bow and felt the ship trying to persuade the water and the water trying to pretend it had never been persuaded in its life. She saw farther out a flight of gray shapes like the backs of knives. Whales. When they breached, the air bloomed with the smell of them. Old, deep, clean. One rolled an eye the size of a dinner plate and looked at her as if to say, "You think you own journeys." She laughed, and the sound blew away. They found rock after weeks of nothing but water. Not an island so much as a citizen of the Sirac world. All knobs and spines and birds that called in voices like badly tuned flutes. They anchored there and took water from a trickle that tasted of lime. Arya climbed a little way and found, wedged in a crevice, a scrap of wood that had once been shaped by a human hand. A piece of a bowl, a rim smoothed by fingers she would never know. She held it and felt the pleasant shock of recognition. Others had walked past the edge of their paper. She put it back where she had found it and left it. Discovery and theft are cousins. She did not wish to invite them both. At night, when the stars looked as if someone had shaken a sieve full of diamonds, she lay on her back and tried to teach herself not to think of lists. The sea made lists by itself. The creak, the slap, the sigh. She let those do the counting for her and slept. On a day when Daenerys had talked for 6 hours to men who could not believe that a woman would ask them to be reasonable and then had dismissed them to go be exactly that, Drogon came down out of the high blue like a long, dark thought and laid his head along the stone below her window. He had begun to sleep on roofs, which made some builders despair and others, secretly, plan houses that could bear dragons as easily as cats. She loved him without sentiment. She put her palm to his eye ridge and felt the slow blink travel through him like a wave through wheat. "Are you lonely?" she asked him, a foolish question, because dragons were not shaped for the human word. He made a sound that was not a denial and not an admission. "So am I," she said. "But I am also busy." Tyrion brought her a list of names and a bottle of wine and a problem that he thought should be given to someone else to solve, only he had run out of someone else's. "The Crownlands," he said. "They have grown fond of sycophants. They will need a lord who can tell them what they do not want to hear and not be killed for it. That usually means a woman with a face like a winter fence. Do we know one? Daenerys said. I can think of 3, Tyrion said dryly. But 2 are already doing jobs that would leave corpses if they were to stop. Choose a 3rd. Let them choose, Daenerys said. Give them a slate. Put a woman's name first on it. See if they have learned. He did, and to his private delight, after many arguments in market squares and in the backs of inns, and after 3 fistfights that ended not with blood but with agreements to disagree, they chose a woman whose late husband had kept accounts that could be read without cursing. They chose her because she did not whisper flattery, and because she had made the noisy men fall silent by asking them to bring her numbers instead of adjectives. Tyrion told Daenerys, and she smiled with weary satisfaction. The smile of someone who has found evidence that gravity still works. Then there is hope, she said. Jaime went to Casterly Rock for a fortnight and found it not a home but a habit. He stood on a terrace where he had once watched the sun crawl along the sea like a lazy dog, and remembered a boy who had thought he was invincible because he had never yet been forced to break into a walk. Servants, careful not to stare, took cached Lannister indulgences out of cupboards and dusted them with compressed nostalgia. He sorted through ledgers and jewelry and clothes as if he were deciding what to keep in a life and what to throw away. He sent most of it to the city. He kept a ring that had been his mother's and an old book about the art of tournay that made him laugh. He found a boy in the village who had the correct kind of evidence in his fist. A sheaf of figures, crooked columns, notes about sheep and weather, accurate, readable. He made him steward and told him not to steal more than was expected. Back in the city, he went to the sept and lit a candle again. The flame took the wick greedily. He believed, if he believed anything, in the discipline of light. When he came out, he met Brienne, and they walked in a silence that did not need mending. Will you stay? She said at last. I am learning to, he said. I don't know if I will ever be good at it. Few are, she said. We give medals to men who leave. We do not give them to those who remain. Then I will try to earn nothing, he said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. News came that the Golden Company had splintered. Some had been taken into the Stormlands because even the proudest Sellsword is proudest of his ability to mend a fence when the coin runs out. Some had gone back to Essos with a speed that suggested mercy was teaching them to alter their trade. One group, too cohesive by half, took to the Riverlands and called themselves something like the Buttered Knives, which was meant to be a joke and which ended badly when they tried it on the wrong village. The villagers had been through so much they had forgotten how to be easily cowed. They fell upon the Buttered Knives with kitchen iron and farming anger and sent the survivors to the next town, where a man with a lute turned the tale into a very different song, because that is how stories survive, by changing their clothes. On the 4th month, a thin, almost transparent man arrived from Old Town with books strapped to his person, as if he feared they would float away in the river air. He had been sent by the Citadel because the Citadel knew an opportunity to behave as if it were necessary when one presented itself. He presented Daenerys with a treatise on sewage and a second on plague, and with a third that was a polite argument that perhaps governance should consider wider consultation with those who write about governance for a living. She thanked him. She had a bridge building to oversee and could not give him the spectacle he hoped for. Tyrion took him to a tavern and introduced him to a woman who brewed beer so clean you could see your decisions at the bottom of a mug. He left them arguing about the relative merits of law and custom and went to count ropes. At dusk on a day that had been unremarkable except for the number of small things accomplished, Arya's ship came into a wind that seemed to have learned a new language. It smelled of iron and of something sweet and of a stone that had been wet for a very long time and had dried only yesterday. The old captain put her hands on the wheel with a concentration that sucked sound out of the air. Ahead, the line of the horizon thickened as if someone had underlined it in ink. When the land resolved itself from that line into something with edges, Arya felt her heart move in her chest like a bird against a window. They did not land the first day. They went along the shore and made notes on scraps of paper that would be lost or used to stuff leaks. The coast was not kind. It lipped up and down in a way that made anchorages treacherous. The trees stood at angle. Yes, like men who had been sleeping badly for years. They chose a bay with a beach where the pebbles lay in tidy curves as if the sea had combed them. When Arya put her boot down, the ground felt not new but old in a way that suggested no one had asked it to do anything in a very long time. She walked 6 steps inland and found a tangle of creeper and a bird's nest with 3 speckled eggs inside it. She stopped there because sometimes not going further is the bravest thing you can do. She turned and looked out at the ship. She waved. Men waved back. The old captain did not. She had learned not to make promises with her hands. They stayed 2 nights and left no sign of themselves but the indentation of a fire in the sand that the tide took back without ceremony. Arya carried nothing away but a small piece of driftwood that fit the hand and had no value. She would whittle it into something later and then probably lose it. That, too, is a kind of sense. When they were a week from where the world's paper ended again, a storm found them that had not been born in any place humans could name. It had the feel of something old and particular, like a god with a hobby. The ship rode it because there was nothing else to be done. In the middle of the night, Arya went up to the waist and held on as if she were hugging a stubborn animal. The rain hammered. The sea heaved. In the white climbing foam she thought she saw shapes. She did not tell anyone about them. When it was over, the dawn came up as if it had invented modesty, and the air smelled clean in a way nothing does unless it has been scraped free of its habits. She sat with the old captain and shared the last of Tyrion's cheese. It had gone hard. It was still good. "We could turn back," the old woman said. "Bring news. That is what sailors do who wish to keep sailing." Arya looked at the line of the horizon, which had gone back to being thin and tidy and perfectly irresponsible. "We will," she said. "Sometime. Not yet." The first festival in King's Landing that was not coronation or fire or funeral came when no one planned it. It was a day when the bread came out of the ovens not burned, when the stew pots were not watered beyond decency, when a girl who had lost her mother found her in a crowd by hearing her laugh, when a man in the street of silk set out a table of little carvings of ships and did not have one stolen before noon. Someone began to play a pipe. Someone else began to drum with his fingers on a stone. Drogon slept on a tower and snored softly in the warm mid-afternoon. Daenerys walked among her people and did not take a bodyguard because she had learned that fear is contagious and did not wish to sicken anyone with hers. She stopped at a stall where a woman sold quail eggs dyed with onion skins and marigolds. The woman did not recognize the queen and did not care to, even when her neighbor nudged her and hissed. She held up the eggs for inspection as if showing jewels and said, "They keep well even in heat. Take 2 and you can feed a child before he starts grizzling." Daenerys bought 2. She gave one to a boy who had been following her at a respectful distance, as if she were a stray dog he had decided to adopt. He took it, bit into it, and said, "It's good," in the tone of a man surprised by a kindness he had not paid for. Tyrion watched from under a canvas awning. He had a cup of bad wine in his hand and the knowledge, more satisfying than the wine, that for this day at least, the city did not look like a place prepared to betray itself. Bronn sat beside him with his boots up on a bale of straw, counting in his head. "How much does a quail eat?" he said. "More than you want it to and less than it needs to," Tyrion said. "If we start small," Bronn mused, "by next spring we could." "Be bored of quail," Tyrion said, and clapped him on the shoulder. The letter from the unsullied ship came with a hawk trained by a woman from the Summer Isles who had found the north colder and more hospitable than any summer she had known. Grey Worm opened it and read in the courtyard while the sun made half his face gold and the other half bronze. The men did not sicken. The butterflies landed and went away. There were plants that tasted like cinnamon if you boiled them with patience. There were men who came to the shore without fear and asked questions in a language none of the soldiers had learned. The ship had not stayed long. It would go again with gifts and with people who were not soldiers, and it would leave the soldiers behind. He took the letter to Daenerys. She read it and gave it back to him. "Go," she said. "Not all of you. Part. Leave me some who would stand when I sleep. But go." He nodded. "I will take those who want to see a thing that is not fighting, and leave those who have learned to sleep where they are." He paused, and then, because his mouth had not said a particular thing aloud and he wanted to hear it, said it Thank you. She inclined her head. Bring me another truth, she said. That night Jon rode into the city by the river gate and slept on a pallet in a room whose window looked onto a wall. In the morning he ate with the guard and then went to the throne room and stood at the back while a woman argued for the right to sell fish on a different corner. It took more persuasiveness than he had imagined. People have complicated hearts about very simple things. After, Daenerys came down from her chair that was not a throne and walked with him in the colonnade where a breeze shuffled in like a polite guest. I have heard the North is still the North, she said. It is more itself than ever, he said. They tell the truth and then complain about having to do it and then do it anyway. Sansa counts better than men like to be counted. Good, Daenerys said. She looked out at the city. And you? Are the letters dead yet? They will outlive us all, he said, and be less useful than a loaf of bread to the men who quote them. He studied her face. He did not love her, not anymore, and he was grateful for it in the way a man is grateful to have survived a fever, even when he misses the strange clarity it brings. Some of them will try to push you into a chair again, she said. They will do it because they cannot imagine that anyone who could sit would choose not to. I'll tell them there are chairs enough, he said, and they both smiled at once, surprised by the easy overlap of their thoughts. They went down into the work of the day together and divided it not by rank but by willingness. Later, when the sun lay along the tiles like a lazy cat and the city's noise had settled into evening, Jaime and Brienne walked the wall and spoke of nothing that mattered and everything. Tyrion wrote a letter and then burned it and then wrote another, better. Bronn counted quail. Davos sat at the river and told a story to a little boy about a black sail that didn't mean death. Sansa went out with 2 women to a storehouse and counted the barrels herself. Grey Worm lay on his back and looked at the moon and said a name he would keep saying until it had become not easier but more real. Arya leaned on a rail and watched the back of the world curve away from her and thought, with fierce contentment, that she had made it over the edge and had not fallen. And the bells, in their towers, slept until the next time men would need to be reminded that sound travels farther than folly, and that to ring for surrender is not always to admit defeat but sometimes to make a beginning.